So right now, an extraordinary array of American military assets and power are moving into position throughout the Middle East. A nuclear-powered aircraft carrier steaming into the Arabian Sea, guided missile destroyers fanning out across the Gulf, long-range strike aircraft, air defense systems, and logistics units all being placed on heightened readiness across the dozens of US bases stretching from the Middle East to Central Asia. So this is not a routine rotation, and it's certainly not background noise. No, this is the kind of military posturing the United States adopts when it wants basically every option, including extended, protracted warfare, firmly on the table, which therefore begs the question: what happens not merely if, but when the United States strikes Iran? Not necessarily the targets. Those are largely predictable and not the essence of this video. No, this is more about the real uncertainty in what comes afterwards. What are the repercussions? Because a US strike on Iran would not be a singular event. It would be the opening move in a gambit, a chain reaction, political, military, economic, which with consequences reshaping the Middle East and rippling far beyond it in ways that would outweigh anything that we've seen thus far. Military assets in place, as we say, and history suggesting that once this level of pressure is assembled, leaders rarely walk away empty-handed. So in this video, I wanted to walk through 7 potential realistic scenarios for what could actually follow a US strike on Iran, from the most optimistic to the most dangerous. Not predictions, scenarios, because once the first missiles fly, control over events becomes very limited, very quickly.
This is the Global Gambit.
How are you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we look at geopolitics, economics, and international relations, and how they work in the real world, while speaking to people ranging from CIA Director David Petraeus to historian Sarah Payne and the United States Army General Ben Hodges. All these names, but before we go any further, I'm curious what you think. Do you believe a US strike on Iran is inevitable? And if so, what would it actually do? Deter further escalation, or simply build a downward spiral? Let me know in the comments. Because you see, Iran is not Iraq in 2003. It is not Libya in 2011. And it is certainly not a minor regional actor. It is a country of over 90 million people, sitting astride one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. It has built an extensive network of regional proxies, or what's left of them, and has spent decades preparing for the possibility of direct confrontation with the United States. From Washington's perspective, or America, Trump specifically, the logic is familiar. Deterrence, credibility, preventing nuclear escalation, restoring red lines. From Tehran's perspective, this is about regime survival, more now than ever. And so that asymmetry alone makes the situation incredibly volatile. But to understand why current tensions feel so dangerous, it is worth asking a specific question. How does today's American military build-up around Iran compare to the last time the US decided to do this, 6 months ago? Let's cast our minds back to June 2025, where the United States decided to join Israel in direct military action against Iran during what was known as the 12-day Iran-Israel War. That was a moment that marked a historic escalation, the first time that US forces openly struck Iranian nuclear facilities on Iranian soil. In the days leading up to those strikes, Washington quietly assembled a wide array of naval and air assets across the region. Carrier strike groups were positioned in the Arabian Sea, the long-range bombers forward deployed, missile defense systems reinforced at US bases across the Gulf. The movements were very visible, but also deliberately ambiguous. You see, what followed was a tightly controlled, but also limited operation. 3 sites, Fordow, Nantaz, and Isfahan, hit in a single night during an operation later revealed to involve around 4,000 personnel and more than 120 aircraft. In this case, the goal was not regime change, but capability degradation. It was a demonstration of incredible misdirection, with many people believing that the actual assets involved in this were going to be stopping over in Guam, and then later in the actual night, these strikes occurring, with everybody confused as to how the United States had managed to get away with this. In response, Iran dealt with a largely symbolic retaliation on El Udeid Air Base in Qatar, carefully calibrated to avoid casualties, and directly communicating to the Americans that they were planning to hit this base, allowing the Americans deliberate amount of time to evacuate to ensure no casualties were occurring. Absolute incredible scenes of diplomatic signalling. Now, today, there is some posture that shares some similarities, but also critical differences. Once again, the United States is concentrating high-end assets near Iranian borders. A nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, has moved into the Arabian Sea. Air Force units across what's known as CENTCOM's area of responsibility have been placed on heightened readiness, and multiple day air drills are underway already across dozens of host nations with deliberately vague timelines and locations. So this is therefore not routine signalling as last year. Abraham Lincoln is not merely a symbolic deployment. It is the flagship of the Carrier Strike Group. It brings with it thousands of personnel, dozens of strike aircraft, guided missile destroyers capable of launching land attack cruise missiles, and layered air and defense systems. In practical terms, therefore, it represents a self-contained defensive platform, a mobile airbase that can sustain high-tempo operations without reliance on regional airfields for ages. Comparatively, in June of 2025, similar assets were deployed shortly before strikes were launched. In late 2025, a comparable pattern was observed when the US stockpiled forces in the Caribbean ahead of its military operation against Venezuelan targets and, of course, then Maduro. But that does not mean a strike is inevitable. History suggests that when Washington assembles this level of force, it is at least preserving the option and signalling that it is willing to use it. Carry a big stick, but you don't necessarily need to use it, kind of doctrine. Now, against this backdrop, Trump's rhetoric matters, of course. Public threats, claims of protecting civilians, and warnings that future action would dwarf previous strikes all raise the political cost of restraint. A case of, well, lack of follow-through. With that in mind, let's go through the potential scenarios, starting with the most optimistic and ending with the most destabilizing. Escalatory ladder, if you like. So, scenario 1, the optimistic one. Surgical strikes, regime and a democratic transition. This is what most people would like to happen. The US basically conducts limited precision airstrikes on specific targets. They would likely include things related to the IRGC or Revolutionary Guard, launch sites and key elements of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Civilian casualties are minimized, the strikes are short, but the message is clear. Under this pressure, an already highly weakened regime collapses. Internal opposition fills the vacuum. Over time, Iran transitions towards a genuine democratic system and reintegrates into the global economy. This is the scenario often implied, quietly by proponents of large-scale military operation. But history is not kind to this idea. Both Iraq and Libya illustrate what happens when a dictatorship is removed through external force. Neither experienced a smooth transition to democracy, and instead power vacuums, militia, and prolonged instability or complete civil war ensued. Even in Syria, which saw its regime fall through internal revolt rather than Western intervention, is still navigating this uncertain path, albeit far better than the Syrian civil war of the past 12 years. The scenario is not impossible, but it is highly optimistic and not one policymakers can responsibly assume nor therefore adequately plan on. Scenario 2, which is perhaps more plausible, where the regime survives but it moderates its behavior, what is known as pressure without collapse outcome. The Islamic Republic survives, but at a cost. The United States strikes demonstrate overwhelming force. Iran absorbs the blows as it has, and it recalculates. Support for regional militias is scaled back. Missile and nuclear programs are curtailed, and domestic repression eases, albeit slightly. This would resemble what some hoped would happen in places like Venezuela. The regime's survival, but strategic restraint. However, the problem is credibility here. Iran's leadership has resisted pressure for nearly 5 decades, be that sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or internal protests, none which have fundamentally changed its strategic posture. At this point, expecting moderation under fire may underestimate just how ideologically and institutionally rigid this system has become. And based on the number of deaths and killings that are emerging against their own people. Scenario 3, the regime falls and a military rule replaces it. Some people quietly believe that this is the most plausible internal outcome. Democracy is not a given. Iran's protest movements have been powerful, but they have consistently failed to trigger elite defections, especially in the case of the military itself. You've never seen the Artesh following through on the side of the people and always on the side of the regime. The security apparatus remains cohesive, deeply embedded and prepared to use force without restraint. In the chaos following US strikes, power could consolidate around military council entities dominated by IRGC figures, the most ideological of any. This would not be a liberal outcome, but it could be a stabilizing one for the continuation of the state, but not for the human rights of the country. Iran would be remaining, if not even more authoritarian. Foreign policy might be more pragmatic, but repression will continue, simply under a different banner. From Washington's perspective, this would be an ambiguous result. Sure, the current regime would be gone, but the system largely intact. And just quickly, well, what would that mean different? They may well be even more ideologically driven, therefore causing more headaches and problems for Washington. Now, if you've got any thoughts on this, do let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the video, then do consider subscribing for future topics like this. And of course, my ever growing array of guests. We've got some real belters coming up. Now, back to the video with scenario 4. Iran retaliates against US forces and regional allies. Now, this is quite a plausible scenario. Iran has been explicit in that it will retaliate. While it cannot match US air or naval power, or even the Israelis in that, it possesses a huge array of missiles and drones, many concealed underground or dispersed across difficult terrain. US bases in the Gulf would be obvious and prime targets, but so would infrastructure in countries seen as complicit. Any energy facilities, air bases, ports. As we can see in 2019, when they struck Saudi oil infrastructure, it demonstrated how vulnerable even well-defended systems can be. And for the broader Gulf states, hosting US forces is, of course, a massive invitation. It's a nightmare scenario, becoming frontline targets in a war that they largely do not control, but also do not want. Even limited retaliation would risk escalation, and of course, therefore, miscalculation. Scenario 5, by contrast, is a little bit more specific, focusing more on the economics and the disruptive possibilities. Iran has repeatedly signaled that it could mine shipping lanes, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, this narrow chokehold through which roughly a fifth, 20%, of global oil and liquid nitrified gas or LNG exports pass. Now, Iran has practiced this. It has done it before. And even in the threat of mines would spike insurance costs, disrupt shipping, and push global energy prices sharply higher. Although one remains skeptical given the almost absorption that the markets have shown to these unpredictable moments. We saw that in the wake of the 12-day war and the bombing in Operation Rising Lion, that the oil markets did not react as volatile as many people predicted that they would, demonstrating that perhaps the economics that are getting more accustomed to the growing uncertainties. You see, on the one hand, mines don't offer an immediate dramatic threat. They can sit dormant for a while, and clearing mines in themselves is slow, dangerous work. However, while Western navies then could try to reopen the strait, the economic shock would be immediate when they were struck. So this scenario turns a regional conflict into, very quickly, a global one, overnight, but the biggest factor being when exactly that night would come. Scenario 6 is that the Iranians target a US warship. Now, this is quite unlikely, but not unthinkable. It depends on the desperation of the regime. Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric naval warfare, fast attack boats, drones, saturation tactics designed to overwhelm defenses. A successful swarm, as some people call them, attack that sinks a US vessel, especially with captured survivors, would be huge, a profound shock. And the US has experienced naval losses before, but in the media environment of today, the psychological and political impact would be enormous. And at that point, restraint becomes very difficult. Escalation, all-out potential conflict, would almost be inevitable, and very much not something that we want to see. Lastly, scenario 7 is about regime collapse, but regional chaos. It's of course the most dangerous, and one that the Gulf states especially fear the most. The regime collapses, but nothing replaces it. Civil conflict erupts, ethnic and regional divisions harden. You have the Kurds, the Baluchis, and other groups that seek autonomy or all-round independence. Borders destabilize and refugee flows surge. Iran is anything but a small state, and therefore chaos there would remain absolutely uncontained. Now, Israel may welcome the end of the Islamic Republic, but it's pretty clear that no one would want the Middle East's largest population center to fragment into open anarchy. This scenario would haunt the region for decades, and it's absolutely impossible to determine what or how it would be curtailed. Now, in all of this, the greatest danger is not a single scenario. It is the absence of a clear end state, and most importantly, the impact it has on the Iranian people. Because once force is used, events move faster than intentions. Leaders act to avoid appearing weak, rivals respond to avoid appearing vulnerable. And wars that begin with narrow, unspecified objectives have a habit of expanding politically, geographically, but of course, morally. If the United States does strike Iran, it will not be choosing one outcome. It will be stepping into a spectrum of risks, many of which cannot be controlled once unleashed. That is the real decision facing Washington, of course, specifically Donald Trump, and whether or not he's able to be restrained by some of the perhaps more rationale members of his cabinet, if there are any. If you want more long form content, though, no nonsense analysis, then do consider subscribing and ringing the bell when you know the next video goes live. And if you want to support me further, you can find links in the description to buy me a coffee or join me on Substack where I'm writing more pieces. But as always, we'll see you on the next one. Take care.